born in New Hampshire. He is trained a little bit with Alexander Paris. He's familiar with the Greek revival. And he moves to Burlington. And while he's in Burlington, he is asked to design the second state house in Montpelier, because the population of Vermont was booming in the 1820s and 30s, right? It doubled, pretty much. So he was the one who designed the great Greek revival building, the second Vermont State House in the 1830s, right? And there it is. So you've got the Doric portico, you've got the low saucer dome taken from Roman architecture. But what's really impressive, of course, is the use of granite, right, from Barry, just down the road, and also this beautiful Greek-styled portico with the Doric order columns. Now, Young never went to Greece, clearly, but like so many other architects, he was inspired by prints, right, and etchings, including this one. I'm not saying that he actually saw that, but it's an example of the kind of thing that he would have looked at. This is a print from 1822 showing you the facade of the Temple of Hephaestus, or the Theseum in Athens, which is in the Agora area of Athens. And you can see how closely Young modeled the portico for the State House to that building. The dome itself, of course, that low saucer dome, is modeled after the Pantheon, right? And he would have seen Piranesi's prints of the Pantheon in Rome. There it is, low saucer dome. So this building catapulted Ammi B. Young's fame, right? It put him on the map. And he was much, much in demand after this. And he also was hired eventually by the US government to build federal custom houses, post offices, courthouses all over the country. So he got to be a really busy man because of this building. Thank you, Vermont. Right? But if you look at this, you might be thinking, this looks a little odd to me. I've been to Montpelier. This doesn't look quite right. You're right. It burned down in 1857, right? And Young was so busy designing for the federal government that he didn't have time to come back to little Montpelier to rebuild the building. So one of his assistants was called in, Thomas Silloway, to rebuild it. Thankfully, as you can see from this sort of very touching photograph, the portico survived the fire. So he reused it in his building. The third, right? The third state house on the site. So there it is, right? The portico's there, but you can see how Silloway made it a little bigger. On the side, he added a bay. He also made the windows a little more Renaissance revival. But the main difference is the dome, right? He really jacked it up. There's a big drum, high dome. Of course, the statue of Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, on top. Pretty neat. Look how denuded the hill is behind it. Most of Vermont was completely forestless at that time. All the wood and timber was used for fuel and for trade. So really different. And about the same time that the Capitol was being finished, that the State House was being finished, our church here was being built, right? So this is a really, really interesting building because it shows you almost what I call the sort of the second phase of a Greek revival, right? Where it's more monumental, more muscular, has a much more emphatic presence in the cityscapes than before. Henry Cyril was the architect of the church in the late 1830s, early 1840s, and I think you can see how much the Greek revival style has changed in the 20 years or so from St. Paul's there in Windsor, right? So now you've got a colonnade in front of the building, right? Very impressive. You've got a much more exact understanding of the Ionic columns and their measurements and proportions. You've got a solid pediment, no more window, no more fan window to interrupt that mass, right? Solid wall behind, right? No more windows, nothing to distract you from that solidity. And that's really important in the Greek revival, right? Mass, solidity, strength. And then, of course, a much more archaeologically correct tower, right, based on the Girag monument of Lycidas. Now, Cyril didn't come up with this design all by himself. He had help from Mr. William Inwood, who had designed this church in London in the late 18 teens, right? William Inwood St. Pancras Church in London still stands there today. Look how similar these two buildings are, right? Wow. Same number of columns, same Ionic order, same general rectangular shape. The only difference, of course, is that Cyril used the Girag monument of Lycidas for the tower, whereas Inwood used the Tower of the Winds in Athens for inspiration, a Roman tower that you might see in Athens, and he used that for his tower. But other than that, pretty similar, except for the use of brick, of course, versus stone in the London example. And both of these architects, of course, looked to the Erechtheion, that great temple on the Acropolis, for inspiration, right? Especially the east porch. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. You've got the Ionic order. You've got all these precise measurements and proportions. So again, another building that is very important as an inspiration for this church, right? The Erechtheion in Athens from the late 5th century BC.
Was there any significance to 6 being the number of columns?
They usually like to have even columns so that you would have a space in the middle for the door. 3, 3, boom. Very rare to have an odd number of columns in the Greek temple, because then you would have a column right in front of the door. So here's a close-up of the church here, and look at the Ionic column volumes. Look how this one is sort of juts out in an angle. Now that's Greek revival. Wow, that's just incredible. And look at them, fluting, so delicate, right? And yet making the building so monumental. Well, you're probably thinking here, well, this is all nice, but you know, the Greek revival churches, such as Paris's, or the Greek revival banks, such as the Second Bank, you know, churches really demand towers. They really demand steeples, right? This has been a tradition in church architecture dating back to the early Middle Ages. So, thank goodness, the Girag monument of Lycidas came to the rescue here for this church, for the tower, right? You'll notice also, however, that it's a little bit different from the original one in Athens. Chiefly, the bays are open. They're not solid. For a couple of reasons, I think. Number one, it lightens the load on the roof. Number two, it's less resistant to the wind, right? So the wind blows right through it. And I think it also provides a nice counterpoint to the blank massiveness beneath, right? You've got the pediment, you've got the solid walls, and here you're up higher towards the heavens, it's lighter, right? And I think your website states that, the church's website states that because music was so important in this church, that they chose the Girag monument of Lycidas as the tower because of its connotations with music and performance.
Music is still critically important in this church.
So that's why this was such an obvious model for the tower. It's hard today to really think back on how monumental and dramatic this church was in Burlington. This is a photograph from 1860. Goodness gracious, there's Church Street. Look at that. And there's the church. So the Greek revival, obviously very important for adding a sense of monumentality and grandeur and having a sort of a civilized look to the sort of rough and tumble look of most American towns at that point. And the Greek revival, of course, spread throughout the Midwest and the South. There were 2 new southern states in the 18 teens, Alabama and Mississippi, and you'll find a lot of Greek revival buildings there as well, especially mansions. And the state capitals of Illinois and Ohio also built in the Greek revival style, right? As settlers went west to settle these areas. The Greek Revival was also very popular in domestic architecture, as a little side note. We have a wonderful example of that right here in Burlington, the Follett House, right? Now the headquarters of the Pomerleau Real Estate Company, built in 1841 for Mr. Follett, who was a railroad tycoon, and he asked Aimé B. Young to design it, right? He had already left town, right? He was already designing his courthouses everywhere in the country, but he did design this house in 1841. But the sort of temple, sort of square block look that you see, not very popular for houses, as it turned out, right? Because most people wanted their houses with a little more variety, a little more picturesque outline, a little more differentiation in plan. So you can see that wings became really popular in Greek Revival houses, like the famous Wilcox House here in Orwell, Vermont, which I'm sure you've driven by if you've driven on 22A. There it is, by James Lang, who also designed the Shoreham Church in Shoreham, James Lang. So when I gave my talk at the Sovereign Museum, I looked at the Caldwell Banker real estate, and it was for sale for $2.4 million. Yesterday I checked, it's half price. Yeah, it's like $1.3 million. So go for it. Yeah. It's for sale now. And if it looks a little familiar to you, of course, the Wilcox House was used as the model for the EHW Memorial Building at the Shelby Museum in the 1960s, right? Oh, yeah. So, there it is. Right. So why was the Greek Revival so popular, right? From South Carolina to New York and Maine to Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, 4 main reasons. Number one, the Greek architecture is really a simple architecture based on the post and lintel system, right? A vertical beam, a vertical column or post, and a horizontal beam or lintel. Easy to do, easy to replicate, not too fancy, right? Easy to understand, as you can see from these examples. Roman architecture, of course, uses the dome and the arch, much more complicated, right? So the Greek architecture kind of appealed to that no-nonsense American builder, right? Build it fast, build it quickly, build it cheaply. Gotta love the Greek Revival, right, for that. Number two, the Greek Revival, of course, had connotations of ancient Greek democracy. It's no accident that a lot of towns that were founded in the 1820s, Utica, Troy, Athens, are named after ancient Greek cities. Number three, the War of 1812 had ended fairly recently, and Americans were not going to look to Britain for inspiration, right? And the last reason why it was so popular was, of course, the Greek War of Independence, right, in the 1820s, when the Greeks were themselves fighting the Ottoman Turks for their independence. That lasted about 10 years. They won. But the Greek Wars of Independence really galvanized public opinion, right, towards all things Greek. And I think that helped to popularize the Greek Revival in America. But then, of course, there was a steep and dramatic downfall of this style around 1850. What happened? Well, for that we have to go back to our man here, Stephen Gerrard, right? He's the one who acquired the first bank of the US when it was not renewed. The charter was not renewed in 1811. And he bought this building and he founded his own bank called Girard Bank, right? So Stephen Gerrard was a French immigrant. He lost his right eye when he was 8. So, bad joke coming here. I guess he had a really good eye for business and making money. Anyway, sorry, terrible joke. When he died in 1831, he was the richest man in America, right? And he left $2 million to found a private boarding school, or college as they were called, for orphaned white males. Those restrictions have since been lifted, but those were the restrictions back then. The executor of his will was Nicholas Biddle, the man who thought that the Bible and Greek architecture were the only truths in the world, right? So Biddle thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to really push for the Greek revival style here for this college that I'm really supporting. So Biddle hires Thomas Eustace Walter to design Girard College, right? And this building is just extraordinary because it is the only Greek revival building in America that has columns all the way around. Oh. Peripteral, right? Peripteral columns all the way around. And I love the way people are using it as an observatory. You see people on the roof looking at the view because it's kind of on a rise, right? Everything is made of marble here. Very expensive. Very, very, very expensive. And here's a close-up today. So this is Girard College, designed by Thomas Eustace. Oh no. There we go. Thomas Eustace Walter designs this building in a very elaborate Corinthian order style, Greek revival. The capitals are modeled after the Choragic monument of Lysicrides. I know you're really sick of me saying that, it's true. But it had huge problems. This building was a complete failure. Number one, there were 4 square classrooms on each floor, all 3 floors, and they were domed. They had arches inside. They were domed, all built of stone. The acoustics were horrible. You couldn't hear yourself talk or think. That was one problem. The other problem, of course, was the 3rd floor classrooms had no light. Because you see how tucked away under the entablature they are? There were little ankle lights, ankle height windows at the bottom, very low ceilings, so they were soon abandoned. They couldn't use the 3rd floor classrooms. They just were completely worthless. And of course, really, 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 really expensive. So in a way, even though it's the epitome of the Greek revival, it's also a complete disaster because it didn't function as an educational building. And people took note of that. Don't feel too bad for Thomas Eustace Walter, however, because in the 1850s and 1860s, he designed the dome of the US Capitol and the new wings. So he was busy with that. So we would not shed a tear for him. So that was one of the major reasons why the Greek revival became unpopular. The scandals associated with this building. But then Nicholas Biddle also had a role to play in the downfall of the style. How come, since he was supporting it so much, right? How did that happen? Well, Andrew Jackson, he's elected president in the late 1820s. He's the first president not from Virginia or Massachusetts, right? He was born in the Carolinas, border north-south, lives in Tennessee. He hates the East Coast establishment. He hates Nicholas Biddle. He calls it the Devil's Bank, right? The second bank is the Devil's Bank. Look, there's a little devil right there. That's Nicholas Biddle. And Nicholas Biddle did not like Andrew Jackson, and he campaigned against him for his re-election. So Jackson got back at him, and he said, oh, okay, I'm going to withdraw all the government monies from the second bank, and I will not renew its charter. So that was the end of the second bank. As you can see, the columns are collapsing. Right? This is Andrew Jackson's order for the removal of all government funds from the second bank. And that caused the downfall of the bank, the downfall of Biddle, and pretty much the downfall of the Greek revival style, to be honest with you. So I think it's ironic that if in the 1820s, the Greek revival style stood for democracy and strength and wisdom, by the 1850s, it had been completely discredited, right? As far as high architecture. Expensive, didn't work, and associated with scandals, right? When Girard College, over here on the right, opened in 1848, this building also opened in 1878. Another educational building, right? The Smithsonian Institution, founded in 1846 for the diffusion of knowledge amongst men. Sorry, ladies. Not part of it. So the architect was James Renwick, and boy, this is as far away from the Greek revival as you can get, right? Towers and turrets and red sandstones and arcades and arches and rose windows. Wow, there's not one pediment, not one column, not one bit of marble in sight, right? Interesting. Both educational buildings, but looking back to very different antecedents, right? The Greek revival looks back to the ancient Greek world, whereas this building looks back to the medieval world of Germany and France. And finally, I want to show you this painting, because it kind of sums up our lecture today, right? It's by Thomas Cole, one of the great American painters who kind of spearheaded the Hudson River School artists. And this may be him reclining on this column. And he's looking at this imaginary world, like the curtains have been pulled apart, right? So it's like a stage set. On the right, in the light of reason, you see Egyptian, Greek, and Roman architecture, right? On the left, in the shadows, you see Gothic architecture, right? Really appealing to that romantic imagination that's kind of percolating in the 1850s. Well, you know what I did the other day, and you can do it too? You could also recline, like Thomas Cole here, right outside. You'll have the same thing, right? You will see what Thomas Cole saw, right? Greek revival architecture on the left, with our church here, and that wonderful Romanesque and Gothic mixture that you see on the right with the First Methodist Church right next door. Look at the high-pitched roofs. Look at this massive tower. The use of sandstone. The use of polychromy, right? Different colored stones for the buttresses and for the window surrounds. That really is a great example of Romanesque and Gothic revival, right? Which pretty much supplants the Greek revival, obviously, in popularity. But it's so nice that you could just step out the door and be Thomas Cole. Right? And we're lucky to have that in Burlington. Right? Well, are there any questions that I might answer for you? Yes?
Do you know the story of why the Girag monument thing on the top is three-armed?
Was it for a tripod?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was for a tripod.
So the original temple held a cauldron of...
right, a cauldron of fire or coals. Yeah, exactly right. Another reason maybe why white was so popular was when these temples were rediscovered in the 18th century, all the paint had disappeared. So early archaeologists believed that Greek temples were white. They were not, they were painted. But they didn't know that. So that's why white became the motif for many Greek revival buildings.
When I was in Italy,
Yeah.
I bought a book on architecture, and it had, not Italy, Greece. It had many of these, beautiful temples, and they were all painted. And in my book, there's overlays.
Yes.
So you can see what it would originally have been.
Yes, I love those little books because they really give you a sense of what they look like. You have the sort of overlays between the ruins and what they would have looked like originally with all the colors and paint. And it's almost gaudy to our eyes, right? Because we're so used to looking at the white marble. So, yeah.
I'm surprised you didn't take some pictures of the UVM green and the architecture, which mimics a lot of what you had highlighted in one of your pictures.
Yeah, the R. Allen Chapel, obviously McKimmead and White.
And then the library and, and that whole lofty.
Yes, that would have been good. It was too cold that day.
But that architect was also hired to come to UVM for that.
McKimmead and White. Yeah, they were the great sort of Beaux-Arts architects in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they really, really loved, they're spearheaded sort of the colonial revival, and that's why so many of the buildings that they built, like the Waterman building, is McKimmead and White.
And they were designers for significant buildings around the world. Right?
Yes, or in America at least. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You didn't speak about the inside of the church.
No. No time.
Next time.
No time. Next time. Yeah.
The building for Supreme Court
Yes.
outside, what is that? Is that a Roman or?
That's more Roman because it only has columns in the front. It's on a high podium. And that was done by Cass Gilbert, who was a very important Beaux-Arts architect as well. And he designed the Supreme Court. He designed the state capitol in St. Paul, Minnesota. So a lot of these heavy sort of, the Beaux-Arts is obviously based on the classical styles, but it's much more monumental, much more oomph to these buildings. Supreme Court is really majestic and monumental, not as graceful, not as refined as our Greek Revival buildings.
Is there any building that has a combination of this rectangle and together?
Well, the State House in Montpelier has that sort of low Roman dome, and then the portico. But actually, I sort of cheated. I really shouldn't tell you this.
Yeah.
But the second bank, actually, when you walk in, it's a big barrel vault. And the Greeks didn't do vaults, right? They didn't know how. So that's another example of a building which combines a barrel vaulted interior, but you can't see that from the exterior. Yeah.
I was reading that there's a move afoot in the federal government to re-emphasize
Yes.
neoclassical style.
Right.
Does that mean we would start seeing Greek Revival or Roman styles start to be implemented again?
Well, it's just a proposal for now.
Yeah.
I know that the American Institute of Architects and many other institutions are vehemently opposed to that because that would be sort of tamp down on the creativity of modern architects to do their thing. But, you know, we never know what's going to happen these days.
Don't forget to vote.
And the World War II Memorial is an example of that. Right. The World War II Memorial in Washington is an example of that.
Oh.
Right. If you've been there. Yeah.
So most of the classical buildings you showed,
Yeah.
Greek Revival, are, you emphasized how a lot of them were built in marble and so forth. Obviously ours is not. It's
Right.
wooden.
Wood.
But it looked like in the old photographs that it's not white paint, it's something else painting it. So I wondered if they originally painted it to look sort of like stone.
Maybe, yeah, that first photograph in the 1850s, it does look awfully dark, doesn't it?
It actually looks darker than the brick behind it.
Right, yeah. Maybe it was left in natural colors, I don't know. Yeah, I tried to find other photographs, but I couldn't do that online. They didn't have any, that was the only one I could
We've
find.
done a lot of repainting, but we've never researched the paint color, so maybe we do that.
It is true that a lot of the white, most buildings in New England were left plain, right? Wood or ochre, dark tones. So the Greek Revival was really kind of shocking because they painted their buildings white, which didn't fit in to many of the urban scapes that were there in the 1830s and 1840s. So most people did not like the white paint because it really stood out. But that was the whole point, right? In a way, to make these buildings really stand out from their built environment.
Also protect them with the lead paint and white, protects them from rotting as fast.
Yeah, I would think so, yeah.
I live in a Queen Anne Victorian, which lost its favor towards the end of the 19th century.
Right.
Where's the Queen Anne Victorian style in this?
It's 1880s, 1890s.
So it's a short amount of time.
Short amount of time, yeah, 1880s, maybe up to 1910, maybe 30 years.
Yeah, then
And then it gets swamped with the Beaux-Arts style. And then that gets completely obliterated by the modern style in the 1940s.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming. It was really enjoyable.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.